Hi there, I'm Richard Frank. I'm an artist and designer here at Media Molecule. In this Dreams Masterclass, I'm going to be showing you how I like to build environments using the wireless controller. I'll be sculpting, painting and assembling a game level, then finishing off with lighting and effects. I assume you know the tools pretty well, so there won't be too many detailed instructions. It's more about thought processes and techniques. I won't make anything too complex or stylized, so if you're making your own level, you can add your own style and detail. I'll also work as efficiently as possible, so I can build a nice large scene and leave room in my thermometer for characters, contraptions, logic, etc. And on top of all that, I'll be designing the level so it plays well and feels fun, as well as looking good. There's a big difference between a cool-looking environment and one that's fun to play. The way I work allows me to refine the playability and the look of the level as I build and playtest it. This means I only need a rough idea of what I want before I start. I've created a collection of all the parts used in this scene, in case you'd rather just customize and assemble those. Feel free to just watch or follow along as you create your own level. Before you do anything else, play the level to see my finished product. When you finish playing, click the arrow on the video to go to the next step. Before I start sketching out the white box level, there are a couple of things I like to do. First, I usually switch on the floor guide in the guides menu. This helps me orient myself while I work. I then place a puppet in the scene, or whichever character the player will use, to give myself a scale reference. Now, I'll start sketching out a 3D map of the level in sculpt mode. For this, I'm mostly focusing on the layout and usability, not so much on the look. They do have a relationship, of course, but to start with, I like to deal with them separately. If they're both great in their own right, then when you bring them together, they'll be awesome. At this stage, it's usually a good idea to have a plan of what you want to make. Maybe sketch out a map on paper, or have an idea of the gameplay. I'm going to make a treasure hunt against the clock, set on a tropical island with a main path and lots of side paths to explore. It will have a start and end, and pass through 3 themed areas. I use the stamp or smear shape tool for sketching, with a shape which is about as wide as 5 times the height of the puppet. You can resize it a bit as you need to, but it's good to stay aware of the scale. Using the wireless controller, it's best to make your big movements viewed from the side. So I always position the camera side on to whatever I'm doing, to minimize having to move in and out of the screen. Also, I don't make my sculpt edits too large. Having them in manageable chunks will make them easier to remove piece by piece later. As I'm sketching, I imagine running through the environment as a player. How far off the main path can they go, and where is off limits? Every time I make a significant change, I go into play mode and playtest the scene. I put myself in the player's shoes as if I've never seen the game before. Can I see where I'm supposed to go next? Are there vantage points where I can get a good view of what's ahead? Is it too easy and boring, or too difficult and annoying to get from A to B? I don't want the player to backtrack, so I'll add some drop-downs where they can't go back. There are many other ways to do this, like gates that close or collapsing bridges if you want to get really fancy. Don't forget to add checkpoint gadgets to your finished level if you do use this technique. It's important to leave plenty of space for the props that I'll be adding later. I also like to add side paths that are more difficult to find so that I can hide pickups in them. I'm not worried about making it super detailed or polished at this stage. The beauty of this approach is that I can edit it as I go. I'm pretty happy with this white box level now, so when you're ready, let's move on to the next step. This landscape I've sketched out could be dressed up as any type of environment. Desert and rocks, snowy mountain, grassy hills, or even a surreal alien landscape. With the power of dreams, we can easily make any of these options a reality. When I'm making levels, I always do some visual research to use as reference and inspiration. A simple internet image search should be enough in most cases. In this case, I'm going to do a lush and rugged environment with rocks and foliage. I could add all that styling and dressing to our huge sketch sculpture, but that would take ages. Since I love being able to change things up as I work, I prefer to build a set of pieces to assemble the level from. That way I can easily edit the layout of the scene as I go along in a non-destructive way, and get to a larger and more presentable scene more quickly than if I handcraft this one massive piece. The Dreams engine makes it very easy to do this without any issues technically or visually. Once I've assembled the scene, I'll handcraft unique features to make it feel bespoke. I'll start by building large chunks to block out the space, then I'll assemble them, then I'll work on the smaller details. First, I'll make a basic lump of earth, which can be used as ground, wall or platform. When you're ready to get started, go to the next step. So, first I'll build my basic earthy building block. Later, I'll create variations of it, adding grass, rocks and things like that. I'll begin by creating a new sculpture. I want to use a shape about the size of the one we were sketching with before. Remember, that's about 5 times wider than the puppet is tall. I'll use a large hexagonal cylinder for an angular rocky look. I usually use the stamp tool as it's more efficient and I can soft blend it for organic forms. I'm also going to use a standard brown tumbler from the colour palette. Using standard colours helps with consistency, and the tumblers give a more natural look. It's a good idea to set the finish and fleck now too, although I can always change those later. In the shape editor, I'll flatten the shape so I can create a layered look. Also, while I'm in there, I set the looseness and make it variable. This will make the surface less uniform and more organic. Now, I sculpt the lump of earth to look as if it's been ripped out of the ground. When I'm sculpting, I usually use the touchpad with my thumb to rotate the shape as I move it around. If I don't need precision, it's much quicker than grabbing with L2. The sides will need to work as cliffs and walls, so I make them rugged but vertical enough that they can't be climbed. I want to create a rounded hexagonal shape when viewed from above, so the blocks will slot together nicely. It should have a more or less flat top for walking on. If it's not flat enough, just slice the top off with a large soft blended subtract edit. I use the same shape with soft blend to reduce any bits that need smoothing off. It's a great way to make organic shapes look eroded by time. Like everything I make, I want it to look different from all angles, so that I can reuse it just by rotating and scaling it. For now, I'm happy with its silhouette from every side, so when you're ready, move on to the next step. Now it's time to add some finishing touches to this earthy building block. There's no point in adding too much detail to these chunks at this stage. We can always add more later. It's better to wait till the level is assembled, so I know which bits the player will see. At this stage, I also like to touch up the colours of the sculpture using the spray paint tool. When using spray paint, I like to turn up the soft blend and turn down the opacity so it's nice and subtle. I also find it useful to switch on surface snap for spray painting with the wireless controller too. This keeps the imp on the surface of the sculpture. The final touch is to tweak the audio surface type so that the puppet's footsteps sound correct. Now that piece is done, I save the sculpture as an element to my creations. Now that I've made the basic sculpture, I can clone it and customize it to create variants and then save those as nested elements. This means that if I update the basic one, I can update the customized one to pick up the changes I make. In the next step, we'll create some variants. First, I'll clone the earthy block I just made and create a grassy version. When I'm adding new sculptures or paintings to an existing creation, I always change visual feedback to minimal in my preferences. This means I can see more clearly how the creations are working together visually. It does make it less obvious when you're scoped into groups and elements though, so I'll need to be mindful of that. I'll use a similar sculpting technique as before, but in green with a streaky fleck to create the grassy topping. I simply sculpt a layer of grass on the flat top of the earth block, like I'm icing a cake. I want it a bit lumpy, but not too lumpy, as the puppet needs to walk on it. The edges of the walkable area should be nice and clear, so the player knows where they can safely walk. When I'm done sculpting, I go to style mode and turn up the impasto, ruffle and looseness to get the grass effect. A tiny hint of the wave effect simulates a breeze and makes the scene feel more alive. Next, I scope into the earthy block again and spray paint around the edges of the grass with the green tumbler colour. This blends in the hard edge of the grass to make it less artificial. I also like to add some paint strokes with surface snap to the grass. I give them the same fleck, impasto and ruffle as the grass sculpture, but make them a little bit longer. This will break up the grass and make it seem more natural and less like a golf course. I'm also making another variant with just the paint strokes straight onto the earth and blended using spray paint like before. This will make a good blend between the full grass and no grass blocks. You can also use a green shape set to subtract to carve a path into the grass. I like to make a few variants that I know I can reuse in many different places and that will blend together well. Remember to try and get away with making as few variants as possible. You can always add more later. I also set the surface types too, like I did for the basic block. When I've made my variants, I group each one's constituent parts. This makes them easier to move and clone around when assembling them. Before I start cloning them, I save them all out as sculpture elements. Now I'm done making terrain, so let's go to the next step and make some rocks when you're ready. Next, I'm going to make some small, medium and large rocks. For these, I use a grey colour and a plastic finish. I choose a fleck that I like and set the looseness to variable again. The smallest rock is the simplest to do. I simply create a cube and chip away at it with any flat-sided shape. I do this with stamp shape so I can use a little bit of soft blend. I tried to make it look like a different rock from different angles with flat facets of various sizes and shapes. It doesn't need to be complicated. It shouldn't take more than a couple of minutes. Once I'm happy with the shape, I use the spray paint tool to touch up the colour. Like before, I use the looseness, fleck and finish tools in coat and style mode to finesse the look I want. The medium and large rocks are made in a similar way to the earth terrain chunk I made before. Use a flat hexagonal cylinder, stretched a bit, and construct it in striations. The medium rock should be about the size of the character. The larger one should be considerably bigger, the size of the earth block. Remember, it should be as varied as possible from different angles. To finish off, you can go in and subtly spray paint the rocks a bit with the brown tumbler colour. This will make them sit a bit better with the earthy pieces you've made. When I'm making pieces to construct an environment from, I always try to keep the colour palette cohesive. Once I've made my rocks, I use the small rock to create a rocky variant of my basic earth terrain chunk. Now I've got enough bits, I can start assembling the scene. Once that's done, I'll create some more detailed dressing. When you're ready, move on to the next step. At this stage, I would normally start to put together the scene using the parts I've made. I do this using the sketch as a template. As I lay the blocks down, I hide or delete the sections of the sketch that I'm replacing. I also like to add a C at this stage for when we're playtesting, as the floor guide won't be visible. It's just a giant shiny blue cylinder with a bit of wavy effect on it. Assembling the level before I do any detailed dressing means that I can get a better idea of any blocks which might be missing. It also helps me figure out what I'm going to need to create to dress it nicely. As I assemble the scene using the parts that I've made, I can iterate on the layout. Don't forget to flip and rotate the pieces as you clone and place them to avoid any visual repetition. When I'm placing the pieces, I'm not afraid to change the layout a bit. It's a chance to iterate my ideas as I go along. I also start to think about where needs lighting and where I can add contrasting themes to the different areas. One area might have lots of pebbles, another might be muddier, another might have long grass, another might be totally dominated by big rocks. I tried to make the scene fun and varied to walk through. Like before, I playtest it every time I make significant changes. At this stage, I sometimes build new terrain variants like this stone one. I also customize the variants I've already built for specific purposes. When I'm assembling and playtesting, I always make sure to fill any holes the player might fall or squeeze through. I'm also very careful to make sure that the player can't get to anywhere that's off limits. In either case, I usually just grab an earth block, some grass or a medium rock and shove it in the hole. Assembling the scene can take a while, but will pay off and is very satisfying. In the next step, we'll dress the scene with more detail. In this kind of environment, the most common kinds of dressing are the small and medium rocks, which we already built, and foliage. Foliage can and should be created in multiple ways for variety. I always start with something very simple. I simply stamp a few streaky flecks in paint mode to create a clump of grass. I use a wax material for foliage to soften the lighting so the flecks blend nicely. The duplicates feature in the tweak menu is useful to make it bigger. These clumps of grass are really useful to cover up joins in the terrain and even used for gameplay by obscuring the player's view. Again, use the wave effect to make it subtly rustle in the breeze. You can also create a small and simple flower, like the ones in the painting tutorial, and duplicate it the same way. I make the flower white so that I can tint it if I want to. More variety for less memory. I use the draw or brush fleck tools in paint mode to create plants with longer leaves. I use the duplicates option in the tweak menu, but rotate it around a single point to make a fern or similar plant. Remember that paint strokes don't cast shadows, so don't make painted foliage too dense or it will seem weird. I sometimes make the painting physical so it waves in the breeze. Just be sparing with physical strokes as they can get expensive. I turn off the physical tweak for ones that the player will never get close to, as the effect will be too subtle to be worth the expense. For denser foliage, I create a very loose sculpture using a soft blended stamped shape. I usually turn off collidable in the tweak menu so the player can run through it like real foliage. I use the wave effect here like the grass to give it a bit of movement. The main benefit of sculpted foliage is that it casts shadows, so it's better for the thicker foliage and trees. Speaking of trees, I'll make some in the next step. Trees are awesome because they add overhead volume without getting in the way of the player too much. They also add depth to the scene and something for the player to navigate around. Dreams makes it very easy to create them. You can make a forest in no time. Trees come in all shapes and sizes, so I usually make 3 to 5 basic variations. I start by creating a new sculpture using the stamp shape tool and the curve shape. Then I choose an appropriate fleck and a nice dark brown colour. I use the shape editor to make the curve long and tree trunk shaped. While I'm in there, I set the looseness and a little bit of soft blend to merge the trunk and branches together. I clone the trunk shape and scale it to make the branches and roots. It's wise to look at some reference of trees from the kind of environment you're making if you want a little realism. Different trees have different arrangements of branches, so I use that to create a variety of trees. Once I'm happy with the branches, I create a new sculpture for the foliage. I'm going to use the green tumbler colour, but you can make your own choice. I'll tint the clones later with the tint tool to add more variety. When I've made a few trees to populate my level, I'll go on to make some props in the next step. To keep things simple, I'm going to assume that this environment is a low-tech one. So I'm going to make some wooden-looking pieces that I can build structures from. I only need 3 basic pieces to build a lot of different stuff. I start with a plank about 2.5 meters long. That's about 1 story of a building, so I use the puppet as reference for scale. I use a nice dark brown with a wood grainy fleck, so it looks a bit weathered, and set the looseness to variable. That way I get those crafted edges, but maintain the woody texture on the flat parts. You can trim the ends off with a freshly cut wood colour to make them look handmade. I do the same to make some chips and chop marks in the wood. I don't go too crazy with those though, as they can look repetitive when you clone them. You can add more once you've assembled the wooden parts into something. To reduce the perfect straightness of the edges, I subtract with a large soft blended shape to warp them slightly. I clone the plank to make a square section post around the same length in a similar style. Make sure you clone in assembly mode and not sculpt mode, so they're separate elements. Since this is a primitive theme, I'll also make a cylindrical stake. I trim one end of this with an angled shape set to subtract to make it pointy like a pencil. With these 3 things you can make stairs, platforms, doors, fences, signposts and all sorts of other stuff. As I assemble them, I rotate the pieces so that any wear and tear I've added doesn't look too repeated. I also customise them, making sure to group them once assembled so I can save them and clone them around. When I've furnished the level with these wooden structures, I'll add the finishing touches in the next step. When you've got your scene to a place you're happy with, it's time to add sprinkles to your cake. I look at the various areas of the scene and where I need to add my feature pieces. Maybe I'll sculpt a giant tree, or a giant rock with a skull face for a cave entrance. You can use the paint tools with Surface Snap to add hand-painted details to things. I use that technique to add ivy and roots growing on the earth and walls. I also scope into the handmade structures to add holes and damage. It's always a good idea to think about aging the scene to make it seem lived in. Where would dirt or foliage accumulate over years of use or disuse? Where would people walk the most and wear away the grass? You can even search the Dreamiverse for things other dreamers have made to add to your level. Use the sun and sky gadget to get the atmosphere just how you want it. Add spot and diffuse lights to help the player find their way around, light the darker corners or highlight your scene's features. I also use the ground chunks or rocks scaled massively to create distant mountains. It's important to remember to add some ambient and spot sound effects to really bring the scene to life. And add some gameplay features too, of course, if that's what you're making the scene for. I'm going to hide some treasure around my scene and set up a score gadget and timer. You can find out how to do that in the scoring tutorial. That's a very simple bit of gameplay. There are millions of other things you could do. Try creating your own scene and then adding it to a dream to publish it. You can use the items I've made from the collection to give you a head start. Thanks for watching my masterclass. I can't wait to see what you create. Until next time, kittens.